Morning, everybody. It's absolutely brilliant to be here with you. Absolutely just so delighted to have had this invitation, and I've had so many brilliant conversations with some of you already. I'm looking forward to meeting those of you I haven't met yet. I've chosen to focus in our Bible studies over the next couple of days on the book of Exodus. It's one of my favourite books of the Bible, but to be honest, whatever book of the Bible I'm talking about, I'll end up saying, oh, this is my favourite bit of the Bible. So don't read too much into that. But I was basically given a free choice. What was I going to choose to speak on over these next 2 mornings? And as I thought about the conference theme, I thought actually there's something about the way that the book of Exodus, taken as a whole, describes this communal journey of the people of God, not without its problems. You know, this is not a journey on which people are totally united and don't disagree about anything. You know, they have some pretty serious squabbles. There's a lot of moaning. We'll talk a bit more about that tomorrow morning. A lot of moaning and complaining. There are some pretty serious theological arguments. Think of the golden calf. And yet, overall, this is a story, it's a communal story. It's not a story of people's individual salvation or otherwise. It's the story of a whole people journeying together. And it's absolutely foundational to the Bible and, I think, to our understanding of ourselves as the people of God. And it's punctuated with moments of joy, as well as moments of conflict and disagreement and confusion and all those other words that we might use. Think of that brilliant moment at the very beginning where Moses is saved from the bulrushes, and there's just that wonderful moment where his big sister, we don't quite know how old Miriam is at this point, I always imagine her about maybe 10 or 11, could have been 15, who knows, could have been 8. But his big sister, who's been watching, presumably in absolute terror, expecting to see her baby brother either just die of starvation or be murdered, sees him be rescued and then kind of steps forward and manoeuvres their own mother being his wet nurse. I just love that detail. Oh, would you like me to go and find one of the Hebrew women? And the joy that they must have felt when not only have they saved Moses' life, they've saved her little brother's life, but they've also managed to get him back into the family alive for these next few years. Absolutely incredible. And that moment where Miriam later on leads the dancing after the crossing of the Red Sea. There's that wonderful line, and Miriam led the dancing, which I could have given as an overall title for this whole talk. So these moments of joy throughout this complex journey, that seems to me to be something quite realistic there about what it is to be on a journey together as the people of God. So as the book of Exodus describes this communal journey from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land, it is an absolutely foundational narrative, it seems to me, for how we understand our identity as the people of God on a journey, following where God leads. It's a foundational book in the Bible. It sets up key themes for the whole Bible of identity and holiness, of law and covenants, and above all, the mystery, the power, and the presence and glory of God. But in this first session, I want to focus on a part of the story that's often neglected, what the Israelites were moving from. We tend, as Christians, to move very quickly from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land. Just as we tend very often to move very quickly from Good Friday to Easter Sunday. But I want to focus on this experience and detail of what the Israelites were moving from that experience in Egypt of slavery and oppression. And one of my favourite things to do when I'm looking at a whole book like this, which is in itself one of my favourite things to do, to take a really big picture and then look at some of the detail as well. So one of my favourite things to do, and I commend this to you if you're preaching on anything in the Bible, is to look at the very beginning and the very end of the books. I mean, it's a classic academic technique if you're reading a book. You know, when you're writing a PhD, you don't read books. You read the introduction and conclusion. You know, it's a really good technique to do. when you're preaching on a book of the Bible. Compare the beginning and end, because often when you do that, it brings out really clearly the change and the contrast that the author wants us to notice. The change that the events in the book have made to the lives of the characters in it, and by extension, the change that that particular book invites us to make in our own lives. Woo? So that's what we're going to focus this morning on some of the particular beginning and end. Exodus, I've got the readings, you might have brought your Bibles with you, but I'm going to be flicking all through the book of Exodus, so I didn't want you to be having to constantly changing pages. So I've got all the readings that I'm talking about up on here. Exodus starts where Genesis left off, pretty obviously, with the family of Jacob established in Egypt, having arrived there during the famine at the invitation at Joseph. And if we skip to the end, Exodus 40, 34 to 38, the cloud covers the tent and they set out when the cloud moves up from it. They break up camp and move on. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, they would set out. The translation I've got here, the standard NIV, doesn't really give out the force of setting out. The Nicholas King translation translates set out as break up camp, and break up and move on. There's two words used for this setting out, going off again on their journey throughout this second part of Exodus. Yisu and Masehem, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I don't know how those are meant to be pronounced. But they both have meanings which mean pulling up. In this context, pulling up tent pegs, breaking camp, setting out, as well as the much more abstract journeying, which is very often in our translation. Yisu means literally pulled up or uprooted. It's used in Judges 16:3 and 16:14 when Samson pulls up the door frames and pulls out the batten of the loom. It's used in Job 19:10 when Job says that God has cut off his hope like an uprooted tree. It's quite a violent pulling up word. If you've ever camped, which I'm sure some of you have, you'll know that setting up and taking down camp takes time. And when you want to move on, you can't just go, you have to break camp first. There's a lot of uprooting to do, packing up, sorting out. If I wasn't here in Australia, I would be at the Greenbelt Festival back in England. And I always slightly resent having to go and take a whole carload of stuff and set up camp just for 3 days. Last year I camped for a whole extra week doing the volunteer setup because it just seemed more worthwhile to camp for 10 days rather than 3. There's a lot of work getting everything out of the car and back into it. I assume if you're doing that a lot, if you're the kind of person who goes camping every weekend, or in this case, living in a nomadic culture, you know what to do. So we can probably imagine the Israelites quite quickly getting into the routine of what goes where, who carries what, how you pack up that particular bit. But it's still a major operation, breaking camp and pitching camp. It's quite natural that an essentially nomadic society would have specific words for this. And break up and move on, which as I say is Nicholas King's translation for this as a refrain throughout this passage, can sound quite destructive. There's a realism here, though, I think, about the need to break up one thing before you can move on to the next. Reminds me a bit of Mark Zuckerberg's famous aspiration to move fast and break things when he was setting up Facebook. The idea being that if you're not breaking anything, you're probably not moving fast enough. Just before I go back to the very beginning of Exodus, I do wonder if one of the things that we struggle with most in the church is not being very willing to break up camp in order to move on. We literally build churches. They're very physical, static things. I don't know how you organise them legally and so on here, but in England we've built churches over thousands of years, which we've then given ourselves the legal responsibility to maintain for the good of the nation, where each parish is an individual charity. It has to keep the church up. It has to keep the church up to heritage standards nowadays. We're expected to be the national trust with our 15 people in a Norman church. You know, we're really not good at breaking up camp and moving on. We're much happier settling. And part of that, it's not just about our buildings, is it? We also have, particularly I think in the Anglican Church, an inbuilt conservatism. Not least because we're often associated in people's minds, even the minds of people who never go to church, with the good old days. With being guardians of something historic, something sort of nebulously historic that was there. And that has value, but it can also be stifling. And so it seems to me that Exodus is a really fascinating book to reflect on for us, because it's both about the construction of identity through the construction, interpretation, and retelling of a certain version of history, which therefore has a lot to say about us as Anglicans, but also about explicitly rejecting the old order of Egypt in favour of a moving, journeying, tent-pitching people, following a God whose presence is essentially ephemeral, a cloud, a fire, nothing static there. I'm reminded of the encounter of Mary Magdalene with the risen Jesus in John's Gospel, where she recognises him with joy, naturally reaches out to hug him, and is told in what always feels quite a, shivering moment, "Don't cling on to me, I'm going on ahead of you." I'm sure there's a deliberate echo there of this Exodus story. I'll come back to this after we've taken a detailed look at the opening verses of Exodus, but here's just a very brief overview of the themes that emerge very clearly when you compare the kind of first half of the first chapter of Exodus with that last paragraph that we've just looked at. Themes from slavery to freedom, obviously. That's there in our communion liturgy, isn't it? But also from family to corporate identity, from stability to movement, from an exploration of destructive human power dynamics to an overwhelming sense of and joy in God's glory, and from building permanent infrastructure, which I'll say quite a lot more about in a moment, to reliance on God, and to the impermanence, as I've said, of repeatedly pitching and breaking camp. But I'm going to begin by taking a really detailed look at the very beginning of Exodus, focusing in some depth to begin with on the first half of the first chapter, which I've broken into 3 slides so that it's a reasonable size. Can you all read that at the back? Okay. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. We call this book Exodus. That's the Greek title for the second book of the Bible. In the original Hebrew, it's known as Shemoth, which means names, from its second word. These are the names. I suspect, like me, your tendency is to skip over these lists of names when they appear in the Bible, whether it's here or in the beginning of Matthew's Gospel and so on. Not just here, but in several later parts of this book, 6:14 to 25. These are the heads of the ancestral houses. We tend to go, yeah, let's get to the good stuff. But the beginnings of biblical books don't tend to be mere throat clearing. They quite deliberately are constructed to set up the themes that the author wants us to focus on. And these first few lines powerfully and economically set up the theme of the identity of the people of God, which runs through the book of Exodus. Here are people as individuals. We know some of their stories from the book of Genesis, but they're also named here as heads of proto-clans or tribes. There are 12 named sons, but also associated households. Typical, missing out the women's names, but we won't go into that in too much depth. 70 children, grandchildren, and perhaps great-grandchildren of Jacob, but far more than 70 in total when we add in wives and servants, because of course we're not simply talking genetic family households here. We're talking whole households in the Old Testament sense. This is not just then a family history. It's the introduction of what's presented here schematically as the founding dynasty. Jacob, his immediate descendants in his lifetime, and then in just 7 lines, we've moved swiftly to the death of that whole generation, but the growth and the multiplication of the dynasty, so that the land was filled with them. These brief introductory lines also hint at the inevitable tensions that are going to come with growth. We already know, of course, from the story of Genesis, of all the sibling rivalry, jealousy, and betrayal that lie behind that bland statement that Joseph was already in Egypt. The restatement of the names of the 12 brothers reminds us that growing complex families are rarely conflict-free. And as this would have been read for most of its history as a statement not simply about 12 individuals, but 12 tribes with their own complex histories, interdependent but also rivals for resources and status at various times, this introductory section also really economically sets up themes of scarcity and competition. We'll be focusing tomorrow more on resourcing and that theme of scarcity versus abundance. And the context, of course, for Joseph and then the sons of Jacob coming to Egypt at all, back in Genesis, is a major famine across the whole region, which transcended national and ethnic boundaries, and as a result of which Pharaoh and Joseph working together consolidated huge amounts of power and wealth in the royal household. It's the kind of dark shadow underbelly of that lovely Sunday school story of Joseph and the technicolor dream coat and the dreams and everything, isn't it? That suddenly, I don't think I ever, when I was told this in Sunday school, we were, oh, it's brilliant. He had these dreams and then he had this great idea and they built these warehouses and they were able to feed everyone. Lovely. Nobody at Sunday school ever pointed out to me the little detail there in Genesis, just going further back here now, that says, oh, and so they encouraged everyone to sell themselves into slavery in order to buy that grain. But, through that, Pharaoh has consolidated effectively all power in the royal hands. And that's the context that Exodus opens with. And in that context, it's hardly surprising that the land being filled with a growing people is not a cause of unalloyed joy and celebration, but has dark overtones of threat and competition to come. And I don't know if here in Australia you have some of the same tensions that we have in England at the moment with the rise of the far right and a lot of stresses and strains and people using arguments around immigration and scarcity of resources and threat to fulfill and further their own political agendas. But I suspect we're not a million miles away from the kind of dynamics being described here. And so, of course, it comes to pass, and the oppression of the Israelites begins. I'm not going to read out these passages, they're really short. You can read them for yourselves. There are 3 things I want us to notice in this next short section, these 3 verses. First, notice the emphasis on relationship, or more specifically, on the difference that the lack of personal relationship makes. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. In an instant, all that's been foundational to the context of Jacob's family coming to Egypt, all that trust and recognition that Joseph had built up over years of faithful service, first to Potiphar, then through his experience in prison, then to Pharaoh, all the acclaim he had received as a wise interpreter of dreams and a skillful administrator, all that crumbles to nothing as the generations move on and Joseph is forgotten. The importance of retaining intergenerational memories as time passes is a really important theme, not just of the book of Exodus, but of the whole Pentateuch. It's part of the point of the Pentateuch, the Old Testament of the Old Testament, if you like. And there's a subtle point being made here about a key difference between the Egyptians and the Israelites. that the Israelites are the people who have not forgotten where they've come from. They are people of the book. They are people who are keeping and retelling these stories. Corporate memory is important, and it's an important dimension of the Pentateuch in particular, as a theme of what the Bible is for, the holding of corporate memory as a formational aspect of a corporate identity. Secondly, notice that oppression begins out of fear. Given the theme of our conference, it's probably worth noting that fear might be described as the opposite of joy. And fear has at its heart a competitive them and us view of the world. The king here mentally divides the world into his people and the Israelite people. He says to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. The Israelites are othered, put into a separate category of humanity, and thus can be treated inhumanely. It's one of the joys of Exodus, and I think particularly of the Old Testament in general, that in exploring the theme of identity and what it means to be the people of God, it doesn't shy away from exploring how national identity can be harmful and destructive, as well as a source of joy. And thirdly, notice what the Israelites do when they are set to work. We're told that they built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. I find this an incredibly poignant detail. Not only are the people oppressed with forced labour, they're used to build the infrastructure that will facilitate their own oppression. I'll say that again. They're used to build the infrastructure of their own oppression. I'll come back to this point. But for now, let's just note that building cities in the ancient Near East wasn't just, it wasn't like we do now. We're just, there's a bit of land next door, let's build something on it. It was really a mark of monarchy. Building cities was what a king did, to establish his dominance and literally make his mark. And every city had a pretty standard pattern with a temple at its heart. Now, given the extent to which the second part of Exodus, again, a bit that we tend to gloss over, lots of detail of temple building, we'll ignore that. The extent to which the second part of Exodus is dominated by the description of the building of the tabernacle, what we're also seeing here is Exodus beginning and ending by setting forth two very different visions of temple, kingdom, and nation building, of monarchy. We're probably inevitably reminded of the long Christian tradition of two kingdom theologies, of verses like Hebrews 13:14. Here we have no lasting city, but are looking for the city that is to come. Cities as big, deliberately constructed status symbols are contrasted here with the glory of God moving before the people of God. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. Again, going back to Nicholas King's translation, they started to feel a loathing for the Israelites. If you haven't come across Nicholas King's translation, I do recommend it to you. He's a Jesuit who basically has translated the entire Bible himself. Virtually all Bible translations are done by committee, which has its strengths but also has its weaknesses. And it's just a really beautiful translation to read, but also has his little notes and things. It's fantastic for sermon preparation. One of the things I love, as I've said about the Old Testament, is how psychologically astute it often is. When you look for the emotions being described, very often the text absolutely skewers what goes on in our shadow side. And that's certainly the case here. They came to dread. They started to feel a loathing as they oppressed the Israelites. They started to feel a loathing for them. The text pinpoints here what happens psychologically to us as a result of allowing ourselves to become an oppressor. When we allow our sense of competition with a group of people to move from feelings of unease to actions of oppression, being the oppressor fosters a spiral of increased loathing of the oppressed. A tragic classic example on a domestic level is domestic abuse, where we all know what happens is abusers increasingly come to despise their victim for being a victim and then justify intensifying the cycle of abuse on that basis. And it's the same dynamic that we've seen over and over again with colonialism and racism, defining a group as other, making use of them, and then increasingly coming to despise that group as a result of their oppression, resulting in a downward spiral of institutionalized abuse. So again, if we compare what we've seen so far in this first 14 verses with the very end of Exodus, we can see that we've gone from the effective absence of God from the narrative at the beginning of Exodus. If you notice, God wasn't mentioned in that first paragraph. God doesn't appear until the beginning of chapter 2. To God's continual, visible presence, day and night. We've gone from the very physical, grounded stability of building supply cities to continual movement and three powerful images of impermanence: clouds, tents, and fire. We've gone from the emphasis on human power struggles, jealousies, competition, and oppression to an overwhelming focus on the glory of God. We've gone from 13 named individuals representing an initial family of 70 people to all the Israelites, a new corporate identity that's being forged in the wilderness as a covenant relationship with God begins the long, slow process of transcending our human identities, a process which reaches a climax in Galatians with that astonishing claim that we're no longer defined by race, gender, or status, but are all one in Christ Jesus. I'll just put up that summary of those big narrative arcs again. The more I study Exodus, the more I'm struck by that last one, the contrast between building the infrastructure of empire and the camping with the tabernacle with which the book ends. It's a contrast that encompasses all the others, from stability to movement, from settled occupation to a state of journeying, from reliance on or competition between human powers to rejoicing in the glory and presence of God. It's not just that they're building in Exodus 1 to 5, and Exodus 5, remember, is the episode when their task gets even harder, when they have to make bricks without straw. It's that little detail that they're building supply cities that really gets to me. It's such a prosaic task. They're not building pyramids. They're not building something they can delight in. They're building warehouses. And of course, it's deeply ironic that the need for supply cities is a lesson that the Egyptians learned from Joseph, the original Israelite in Egypt. There's an obvious contrast with the total reliance on God in the here and now, represented by the manna in Exodus 16, which we'll come on to more tomorrow. So at the opening of Exodus, the people are building the infrastructure for self-reliance that their ancestors developed, which has now become a tool of their own oppression. I wonder, as we grapple with our own Christian histories of colonialism and their ongoing legacies of inequality, how this detail might speak to us today. If your context is anything like mine, and it seems strangely similar, considering that we are literally on opposite sides of the world, one of the main things we're grappling with as clergy and as churches, not just today, but in this kind of 10, 20, 30, 40-year period, is the mental shift that we're all having to make in this period of history, from being a church which was building the infrastructure of Christendom to being a church in a period of journeying from what has served us well in the past to a new future that hasn't yet arrived and that we can't fully imagine. And in that context, I just want to focus a little bit more on chapter 5 now, and look in a bit more detail at that episode of having to make bricks without straw. And in case you're bored of me talking now, I found a little video of a skilled artisan today hand-making bricks. It's not immediately obvious, but the powdery substance that looks a bit like sand in there is actually the straw that the text refers to. I always imagined bricks without straw. I was imagining bricks with straw sticking out of them, like a cowpat or something, wattle and daub. It's not. They use the chaff, the stuff that famously in Psalm 1 blows away from the threshing field. They use the chaff to stop the bricks sticking to the mould and to help them form in that particular way. So you can imagine it would have been considerably harder without the straw. Apparently, historical archaeologists, there's huge amounts of funding in America for historical archaeology, and for people to try and prove that details in the Bible were exactly accurate, they'll put a huge amount of research money into it. So people have done all sorts of tests with Nile clay and different types of straw. And they have found that both as an additive in the clay and in that, as we see in that video, the chaff and the straw really do help the brick-making process. So let's look at the text. I'll just put it up in 2 sections for you to read. It's really noticeable that the word lazy is repeated 3 times in those few verses. This immediately follows Moses' first rather diffident approach to Pharaoh with God's message. Moses and Aaron have gone to Pharaoh at the beginning of chapter 5 and asked him to allow the Israelites a few days' holiday to celebrate a religious festival in the wilderness. Obviously a lie. They're wanting to escape, but that's the cover story that they begin with. And this is Pharaoh's punishment, his reprisal for their audacity. But what really strikes me for us today is this strong link being made here by the enemy of the people of God between worship and laziness. Reading this, for me, is one of those moments where time seems to collapse between such an alien culture thousands of years ago and our own very different contexts. It's not a million miles away at all from Pharaoh's words to the way that our modern day cultures find it hard to value any activities that don't seem immediately productive. It's so hard to resist, isn't it, even in church life? So many of us struggle in our own lives and ministries to take proper time off, or to give times of prayer and study their proper priority. Just on the plane on the way over here, I was checking Twitter, as you do, and one of the clergy that I follow in England was doing that thing that clergy do of going, oh, I can't get any time off because I can't get any cover. And I and lots of other people were saying, don't be silly, take time off. If that means your church warden has to read morning prayer, bully for them. If there isn't cover, you still need to take, oh no, I couldn't, I've had to arrange cover even from my hospital bed. We do this to ourselves. Because it's incredibly hard to resist this association of anything other than full-scale, constant productivity with laziness. Especially, I think, in the context that we're all in, where changes in social patterns of work and family life and spirituality over the last few decades have meant that churches generally are declining. Not just churches, any club or organisation are declining. Patterns of association are demographically changing. But that's led to a real sense of urgency and, let's be honest, often panic about our desire for church growth. I don't know about you, but I very often feel, like the Israelites, that I'm being asked in my work and ministry to achieve just as much in the past as past generations did, with fewer and fewer resources, to make just as many bricks with less straw. There's less money, fewer volunteers, fewer clergy, but we feel and often internalise the demand to make just as much as before, be just as successful as before, even though we're being given less and less resources with which to do it. As I reflect on that, it seems to me that this isn't just an internal church problem, it's actually something that's much bigger in the way our society sees Christianity as building social capital. Much of our shared culture has taken as read the shared cultural capital of Christianity as its building blocks. So as Christians, we find ourselves often in a strange position of being both privileged but also co-opted. Increasingly, certainly in England, you can make your own parallels with your own context, as the church, our experience is we're being asked by wider society to make bricks without straw. We're still expected to provide a lot of the basic building blocks of our society. Everyone expects the church to be there, providing a lot of the infrastructure, providing schools, providing food banks, providing social care. There's less and less straw, but we find ourselves still being expected to contribute just as many bricks to the construction of society as ever, both practically and conceptually. Practically, we're still expected to have open churches on every street corner for the lonely or distressed to wander into, to provide food and shelter for those who need it. In England, something like a third of churches operate food banks now. The church that I've just left as vicar, the year before the pandemic, which was the last year that we had kind of reliable statistics for, fed 1 in 11 of the UK's asylum seekers. That's one church, one poor church with a congregation of about 20 in the middle of Liverpool, fed 1 in 11 of all the asylum seekers in the UK in that year. Because there's a big reception centre there and they tend to come through the city. And certainly our previous government came to rely on churches as an emergency social service, while our donors and our volunteers are absolutely creaking at the seams, often themselves suffering from the rising cost of living, and there just being not enough of us. I found during the pandemic, I don't know if it was the same here, that when we closed our churches during the pandemic, there was an outcry in the secular press, journalists and so on, absolutely going apoplectic that the church wasn't open for services, that the church wouldn't be open for Christmas Day, that, you know, what were people going to do if there wasn't a carol service for them to go to? These people had no intention of actually going to a carol service. But the sense was that the church should be there. It was part of what the city was meant to look like. And we expect that of ourselves as well. But I wonder if it's even more important and much more insidious that we're often asked to make bricks without straw conceptually. And I go back to what's happening in England at the moment with the rise of the far right. Nationalism and the far right trade off the cultural capital of Christianity. And they expect it to continue to make bricks to build their empire, demanding more and more of that conceptual infrastructure and calling us lazy when we point out that there is no straw. And so in this simple, dramatic image, Exodus can help us to articulate the unfairness of people being called lazy when their productivity doesn't match up to the demands of a greedy culture, which will always demand more and more for less and less. It can help us to affirm the dignity of those who are unable to work or to work at full pace. The elderly, those who are ill, the disabled, children, carers, artists, dreamers, clergy. It can help us affirm the value of prayer and worship as activities which are good in themselves, a claim which liberates us from the captivity to the demands of greed. If our common purpose is just to make the bricks that our society demands to shore up and extend its infrastructure of empire, there is no joy in that. Now, of course, we always tend to talk about freedom and liberation in Exodus, in the Bible more generally, as if we, of course, are the people of God who are being led from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land. And it's a really powerful metaphor. God does offer us freedom from that to which we are enslaved. But liberation theology would always invite us to read the story from different perspectives and to ask whether we should so easily assume the position of being the goodies when we read biblical texts. Now, this is where I have to hope that my favourite humour travels. This is a clip from one of my favourite sketch shows, the Mitchell and Webb show.
Very well. They're coming. Now we'll see how these Russians deal with a crack SS division.
Hands?
Have courage, my friend.
Yeah. Hans, I've just noticed something.
These communists are all cowards.
Have you looked at our caps recently?
Our caps?
The badges on our caps. Have you looked at them?
What? No. A bit.
They've got skulls on them. Have you noticed that our caps have actually got little pictures of skulls on them?
I don't, sir.
Hans, are we the baddies?
You should be in it with a hole.
We don't very often ask ourselves, as the protagonists in our own story, are we the baddies? But it is a key question of a hermeneutic of suspicion, and worth asking when we look at these ancient texts. As we begin to wrestle uncomfortably in our churches in England with the legacy of colonialism, which is still unbelievably contested. You know, I'm a historian initially, so it strikes me as pretty obvious that all our history is very, very contested, very complex. There's good and bad in every situation. Doesn't seem to be controversial. My goodness, you try saying that on Twitter. You know, the idea for many people that there might be something to reckon with in our past is still worryingly controversial. People hate the idea of thinking of themselves as potentially being the baddies, and partly that's because our drama, or all those war films, has trained us. The way we read books, the way we watch films, has trained us to think in terms of goodies and baddies, and it's very deeply uncomfortable to think of ourselves as anything other than the goodies. But I do wonder how it looks if we allow ourselves, as a thought experiment, to read this story as the Egyptians. It's a really deeply uncomfortable truth that white Western culture has historically co-opted and enslaved the people of God and Christianity to help build its empire. We're still living with some of the results of that. Christianity was put to work in the service of the empire, sometimes deliberately, sometimes very consciously indeed, sometimes unconsciously. It was used to help build the intellectual infrastructure which supported empire. When the Spanish first arrived on the shores of Latin America, they read out the document called the Requerimiento, which was in Spanish, obviously. They met natives on the shore, read out this document, which of course none of them understood, which said, We have come from God, and if you resist us, that proves that you are effectively the baddies, I'm paraphrasing, the enemies of God, and therefore if you resist us at all, that gives us the justification from God to overrun your country, slaughter you all, and take control. They read this, and then they claimed that the fact that they've read this meant people had been given fair warning, and that was their justification for the atrocities that occurred. When the British first started tobacco and sugar plantations in the Caribbean, initially they weren't run by slavery, but economically it just didn't work out. The economics didn't stack up if you were paying people. And initially, the distinction that people made was between Christians and heathens. When you look at the early 17th century material, there's nothing to do with race in there. The distinction is about what religion you are. Very, very early on in the 17th century, some black people who had come across initially as labourers ended up becoming rich and being plantation owners. That didn't last long. And the change that happened was because mission societies wanted to be able to evangelise the slaves on plantations. And so very carefully, over a period of about 10, 20 years in the middle of the 17th century, created a theory of race-based slavery, created racism, effectively, in order to be allowed to go and evangelise. Because the slave owners weren't going to allow them to evangelise if once somebody became Christian, they were no longer a slave, which was the initial position. Christians couldn't be slaves. So they had to come up with a justification for allowing people to become Christians but still remain slaves. And a justification based on skin colour was what they came up with. That's why Christianity is so deeply implicated with the history of racism. It's not simply a kind of, oh, we happen to be there at the same time. It was actually our invention. Sorry, that wasn't in my script. So I do wonder, even apart from that history, where now, as individuals, or perhaps corporately as the contemporary church, maybe it's easier to think on that level, where now are we guilty of demanding of others that they make bricks without straw? Guilty of exploiting the people of God to build the infrastructure of our own empires? But I want us to end not on oppression, it's all got a bit quiet, but on joy. I said at the beginning, one of my favourite things to do is to compare the beginning and the end of a book, and we've looked at some detail at the first and last verses of Exodus to identify those overarching themes. But I want to end by noting the contrast between the prosaic, unfulfilling and oppressive work of building supply cities that's dragging them down all through chapters 1 to 5, with the joyful description of the construction of the tabernacle in chapters 35 to 40 at the very end of the book. The last 6 chapters are filled with minute, lavish detail of the building of the tabernacle. Again, it's a bit that, I'll be honest, we tend to skip over. But there's a real lingering joy in there, in the details of craftsmanship and materials, woodwork, metalwork, textiles, embroidery. There's a delight in technical skill and artistic vision, which I think is something that we very often don't talk about much in church. We decorate our churches with really beautiful, high-quality examples of craft. But, I mean, I'm a quilter as a hobby, so I love anything to do with textiles. But I find I've very rarely heard a sermon or anything in church that talks about the joy in making, the joy of crafting or making, whether that's a model aeroplane out of matchsticks or a quilt out of fabric scraps. I think all those of us who enjoy crafting and particularly textiles can almost feel the joy oozing out of this description of materials and of the techniques and skill involved in making something beautiful. You can imagine running your hands over the gorgeously dyed soft yarns, tentatively stroking a single golden thread marvelling that something so fine was hammered out of sheet metal. We were at the Eka in Brisbane on Saturday, and we were watching people make horseshoes out of an iron bar. I've never seen a horseshoe actually be made out of an iron bar before. Incredible. And people were obviously loving it. And this catalogue of beauty and artistry and skill all serves in the narrative to frame and emphasise the glory of God. But I wonder if there's also a more subtle contrast being offered to us here, pointing out the deadening and oppressive impact on the human soul of being forced to do the work of creation, making bricks for a supply city, without the leavening grace of beauty. So many of the jobs that our factories and our workplaces now require of people. I've done my time in a call centre. It's pretty soul destroying, just sitting there without any windows, just answering the phone, not even allowed to deviate from a script. There are an awful lot of jobs, then and now, which simply require people to behave like machines. And the contrast with the joy and the delight of these last few chapters of Exodus, where they're making these beautiful things and talking about the skill that people have, is just huge. The really stark contrast between the hatred, the competition, and the violence that goes alongside the enforced labour in Egypt, and the joy that marks the description of the work that went into the tabernacle, full of abundance and delight, despite being objectively much more difficult and much more resource-intensive. So I'm just going to invite you to, I'm going to end with a poem, but I'm just going to invite you to spend a few moments in contemplating. You might prefer to do this in silence, you might prefer to talk on your tables. What aspect of your work you find the greatest joy in? Where's the delight in creating something beautiful? Okay, I'll just draw us back together and end with a poem which has nothing to do with the book of Exodus, really, apart from, I just love this poem on the theme of joy. Apart from, it seems to me to say something about this movement that we're invited to go on through this book, from feeling that we have to work really, really hard for God and probably are going to fail, to being invited into this endless journey in the presence of God, where we simply delight in being in God's presence, not having any idea where we're going to go or where we're going to end up or what we're going to achieve by that constant breaking and pitching camp in God's presence. So this is it's a poem called Tripping Over Joy by the Muslim poet Hafiz from about 1320, 1350, translated by Daniel Ladinsky. Hafiz apparently wrote a poem every day. That was his kind of daily pages writing discipline. What is the difference between your experience of existence and that of a saint? The saint knows that the spiritual path is a sublime chess game with God, and that the beloved has just made such a fantastic move that the saint is now continually tripping over joy and bursting out in laughter and saying, "I surrender." Whereas, my dear, I'm afraid you still think you have 1,000 serious moves. Thank you.